Second maxim: no engineering without political deliberation. Now, by this I mean that we examine proposed technological projects for the often covert political conditions and ideologies that their making would entail. I believe this should become an interpretive skill of all people in modern society, especially those educated in our universities. And by the way, I think it's especially important for the technical professionals and engineers whose creativity I greatly respect, but whose narrow-mindedness is often appalling. The education of engineers, I think, ought to prepare them to evaluate the kinds of political contexts and political ideas and political arguments and political consequences their work involves. So an awareness of the subtleties of democratic language and of democratic discussion ought to become part of the toolkit that engineers master in their education. We need to redefine what it is in our society to be an expert, what it means to be a professional. The third maxim: no means without ends. And that one may seem puzzling to you because you think that, well, all technologies pursue an end purpose of some kind. But alas, that is not always true. Many varieties of innovation now pushed on the public amount to tools looking for uses, or means looking sometimes desperately for ends. Those who have dealt with the introduction of computers into the schools in recent years have many colorful examples of this phenomenon. I talk to teachers all the time about this. They were quite perplexed, many of them, by the idea that all of a sudden putting a particular kind of box in a classroom would revitalize education. All the focus was on the means. The ends got lost. I would say, by the way, that during the last year or so, the promotion of high-definition television, HDTV, is another good case of this. You could make a list, let's say, of the 10 most urgent needs in our society, or the 100 most urgent needs, or the 500 most urgent needs, or the 1,000, and on and on. Think of what your list would look like. What needs do we have in this society? You sat down all day and all week, which needs would you list? And then I would say, did you remember to put on your list the need for a sharper television picture? And probably you'd say, well, that's ludicrous. Well, there's nothing wrong with a television picture right now. Does the world need a sharper television picture among its most urgent priorities? And I'm telling you, it's already too late to ask that question. We're going to get it anyway, in all likelihood, at a cost of tens of billions or even hundreds of billions of dollars, because the transnational socio-technical systems of microelectronics find it a necessary next step in their evolution. So they're going to make those means our ends. As we study the prospects offered by new technologies, I think we're inclined to forget how important it is to begin any process of the development by pausing to ask a simple and usually embarrassing question. Why? Why are we doing this? What's the point? What are the ends that we've chosen, and how do they fit the means available to us? And I think it's especially important to ask why questions in and around technology, because questions about how have such an indelible fascination. So you take, for example, the proposal of SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. President Reagan proposed it one evening, and thereafter, for several years, people started debating how would it work? Which would be the best system? Would it be better to have lasers based in space, or ones on the ground that would pop up and start shooting down missiles and so forth? So the questions about ends totally vanished, and the whole discussion deteriorated into a kind of technobabble that focused exclusively upon means. In a similar way, today's language about competitiveness, productivity, innovation, technology transfer, and so forth, simply deflect us from asking the questions that matter. These are second and third order questions: productivity, efficiency, and so forth. Have nothing to do with the ends of human life. And when we talk this language of competitiveness and productivity and so forth, what we're actually doing is embracing, as if they were our own most cherished goals, the interests of business firms. And this is a way of talking that simply leaves all other human interests in the dark. At the outbreak of the bread riots during the French Revolution, Marie Antoinette, as you probably know, is reported to have said, "If the people do not have bread, let them eat cake." I think if she were alive today and maybe teaching at one of our grand technological universities, probably involved in an industrial academic research center, she could be heard saying, "If the people are discontented, let them eat competitiveness." So my three maxims then are: no innovation without representation, no engineering without political deliberation, no means without ends. And I want to conclude by suggesting that those of us in democratic societies have gotten into the habit of thinking that our citizenship is somehow a finished project. We like to think that the fundamental principles of liberty, democracy, and equality worked out, let's say, during the Enlightenment of the 18th century and won during the revolutions that founded the modern nations states, that all of that's pretty much the last word in political wisdom. And I think quite rightly we look around the world and ask, which of the societies that have found ways to guarantee human rights? Which of them have institutions that provide equal protection of the law and uphold basic principles of justice, and which ones do not? And I think in that light it's clear that there are a number of societies around the world in which the attainment of democratic citizenship is a long way off. But I think in the larger view, the quest for democratic citizenship, the quest for a good society, is not a finished project for us either. We cannot rest content with the intellectual and political accomplishments of 18th century theories and 18th century revolutions. New opportunities and new dangers present themselves on all sides, especially those contained in choices we make about new directions for science and technology. I think the reason that these are especially important to consider is that such developments have a kind of special aura around them. We announce ourselves as being ready for change when these kinds of things come along. And some way or other, I think we all understand that the 21st century will be, in some important ways, different from the times in which we live today. Will it be a better society or a worse one? And who will decide? If we're to be empowered in shaping this world, we must become skillful in areas where we are now profoundly ignorant, using ideas and abilities that enable us to define and realize human freedom and social justice within the realm of technology itself, within things like new machines for the workplace, computerized systems of information management, communications devices introduced into our homes, and a great many other such things. If we cannot develop these skills, or do not care to, then it's possible or even likely that human freedom and dignity could well become obsolete remnants of a bygone era. So there's much to do, and I wish us all well. Be happy to answer questions or take rebuttals, comments from the audience.
Yes. Where do you put your three maxims in the practice? Where do we get at these?
Well, it's not easy to put them into practice since nothing in our form of political organization admits it. I think space for acting in these ways has to be created. And there are any number of ways in which that might be attempted. I can give you some examples, but they would just remain isolated examples, and they all have problems with them. In agriculture, I would point to the work, let's say, of James Hightower, Commission of Agriculture in Texas, who's trying to investigate alternative forms of agriculture that are not under the domain of large power systems and which are both socially and ecologically benign, for example. In a number of places around the world, one can see the development of energy systems that have a dispersal or decentralized component as part of their operating principle. There have been all kinds of proposals, let's say, in Scandinavian social democracies, although they have problems, for redesigning systems of office and factory automation in ways that recognize principles of participation and so forth. But it really seems to me, although one can list alternatives like this, one has also kind of in a way missed the point. The real challenge is to try to create institutions and procedures in which these kinds of considerations become an ongoing focus of everyday life for everybody. Right now, we simply do not have the power to operate in these ways, right? Labor unions? In the United States? Well, yes. If they would. But by and large, I think in the 20th century, American labor unions have bargained away precisely the kind of power that I'm talking about here in order to get certain kinds of agreements about wages, hours, and benefits and so forth. Control over the workplace and technologies in the workplace has been bargained away, including the most radical of unions. The longshoremen, for example, went along, although I would say they're probably forced to go along, with the regime of automated containerization of cargo, which has, in effect, rendered longshoring obsolete. It has destroyed it as a form of life in our society. Yeah. Yeah.
Very broad question. Do you see any opportunities for the late 20th century American university to have beneficial effect on this, or has it been so permeated by these outside systematic power forces? It's very difficult to bring the faculty to function in a more alternative management fashion.
So the question is, could the American university have some positive contribution? Well, yes, in principle, although I think the movement right now is to capture the university to the agenda of large business firms. It's always possible that faculty might organize or students might organize and say, hey, we would like to redefine these fields of knowledge and expertise to address fundamental human ends through a process of democratically established research and development and so forth. What one finds, of course, just about everywhere these days are new linkages between the state, industry, and the university, in which opportunities like this are far from the focus. In the place where I work, for example, I've been actually studying some research centers. One of them has to do with manufacturing productivity. And I was talking to the directors of this center, the researchers in the center one day, and I said, I've heard a lot about, and I went through a list of a dozen corporations and so forth. No one's ever, in the time I've heard about these new systems for the workplace, ever mentioned workers or labor. I said, maybe we ought to bring in some workers and have them join these deliberations about robots, computer integrated manufacturing, and see what they had to say. And their response was really quite interesting. They said, gee, we've never thought of that. What a great idea. Langdon, do you know some workers? And the point of the thing is that these possibilities are now defined in ways which, by the year 1990, there's certain kinds of concerns which never entered the focus at all. They've been completely excluded. No one has to pay any attention to them. I happen to be a member of a department in which some of these issues are as a kind of backwater side eddy and so forth, and the current of all these changes get discussed in some way or another. I spend a lot of time trying to teach engineers about politics, philosophy, history, and so forth, specifically in a way that they might call into question their own self-identity, and at least to try to independently define who they are. Yes?
You know, like there was a large group of physicists, you mentioned SDI, who took a rather unusual stand collectively against participating in the funds that were available in the research.
Yes.
Are you aware of any university that has publicly discussed the issue as an institution itself, rather than just groups within it and between?
Which issue is that specifically?
The issue of technology and its political impact.
Well, I think in some way it's being discussed all over the place. My own sense is that the best form of political speech right now is probably protest, because there are a great many kinds of arrangements. I think the best response to right now is simply, no, we don't want to do this. We should stop this, and then think about what we want to do. Put your foot on it. An Australian labor leader once said to me about various kinds of information technologies that labor unions there found disagreeable. Our first response is, put your foot on it, stop it, then you talk, right? What's happening, unfortunately, around the country is that science, engineering faculties, and to some extent the social scientists and humanists as well, are saying, gee, there's a good deal in this, simply working with the large transnational corporations. Maybe we can cut out a role here. We'll change the curriculum to make it more likely that when a student leaves here, he or she will not even have to be retrained in entering a high technology corporation. This is seen as a goal of education in a lot of places. Needless to say, I don't think that's an admirable goal for the university to undertake. I've heard recently, by the way, that the Greenpeace Foundation, which has been set up to spend some of Greenpeace's now considerable wealth. It's, Greenpeace, it stops ships at sea and so forth. It's anti-nuclear, has all kinds of environmental causes and so forth. And they've now set up a foundation. They gave a research grant to the University of London to work on what they thought would be an environmentally benign technology that's been neglected by the state, corporate, and university nexus. Gave a grant to the University of London to study and develop solar electricity. I happen to like solar electricity. I think it's potentially a great boon for humanity. But it's interesting that the funding for that comes not from, let's say, large amounts of public money. It has to come from this kind of radical fringe and so forth element. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Your first maxim about no innovation without participation.
Yes.
I am speaking as a scientist who does not consider himself a technologist. I look at the history of my own science, namely physics. Think of James Clerk Maxwell in the 1860s, who made one of the greatest innovations of the 19th century in physics, which had no technological applications for almost 50 years. I think of Faraday, even earlier, his scientific innovation did not have technological application, again, for about 50 years. I don't see any way in which one could have foreseen in Maxwell's time or Faraday's time what group of by this innovation. So how can there be participation in that sense?
Yeah, I suppose we're using innovation in a different sense here. I really mean it at the point in which you have sort of knowledge plus action coming together to change social life specifically.
You're specifically thinking of technological
Technological innovation, although I see science and technological innovation is increasingly linked, you see. If you look at microelectronics or biotechnology and so forth, this gap, let's say, between discovery and application has simply collapsed. And it's also increasingly purposive. It has specific applications that people have in mind as they're engaging in the research. We want to take this gene and put it into that plant to make a herbicide-resistant plant, that kind of thing. So at that point, let's say what might be called just pure research, the purposeless discovery and the wandering dialogue with surprise and so forth, emerging with what the Germans call Zweckrational, work done for a purpose, engineered for a purpose, and so forth. And in that case, I would say a lot of forms of what are called basic science and technological innovation, the kinds of things that will change society and the environment and so forth, are all part of a single piece these days. I believe, for example, if you want to talk about basic science, that ordinary citizens ought to be put on NIH, NSF, and so forth, review panels for funding. I think we ought to take the notion of a peer in science and say, citizens are peers. We'll let them read the grant proposals and have an equal vote in who gets funded and who does not, rather than use this elite-centered system of funding science. So if you ask me how I would actually include representation and participation, I would say, well, find institutions where it's now at work and democratize those. And of course, there would be great resistance. It's a closed system. Any other comments? Yes, way in the back.
Give an example of techno-feudalism.
Techno-feudalism. Quality control circles, which are brought over here touted as democracy. This article refers to them as democratizing the workplace. But while participation of workers is elicited, it's all within a very tightly controlled system of corporate relationships, corporate decision-making, and so forth. The Japanese have worked it out very nicely. They give something like lifetime employment to at least a lot of people. There are real problems with it in a lot of ways. But in Japan, you're expected to work for a single company in about the same way that a serf used to work for a lord. You're sort of locked in there. Are you self-determining? No. Is there real democratic participation in the sense of free speech? The ability to organize communities in ways that announce independent positions and so forth? No. It's a kind of enlisting a people's activity and support within what in Japan really is, I think, an extension of a sort of industrialized version of the old feudalism. Everyone knows where they are, everyone knows where they ought to be. It has this nice, locked-in structure. And I think this is being proposed more and more for working life in America. Wouldn't it be nice if we could get that kind of thing? Wouldn't it be nice if we all just shut up and allowed this way of living to enclose us? Right? And I think to a certain extent it is. American firms are modeling themselves upon the Japanese success, very often, for example, without unions, for example. Get rid of the unions, who might have some independent voice. Just have nice, happy workers. That's what I mean by techno-feudalism. one of the things I mean by it. David?
Yeah, it seems the way you construct this is start with competitiveness and also ideas of progress. These are sort of hegemonic ideas that beg all the questions that you're asking us to consider.
Yeah.
And that if you look, especially in the last 20 years, people have been asking all the questions. They've not only been asking it, but they've been making great strides in answering it. They've been acting. When you talk about protest, I can't think of an area in which that is true. And yet all of these activities have failed to really gel.
True.
That is not because of an inherent intellectual and political problem. They've lost.
Yes. True.
And the questions have been vague and the people have been silenced because of these ideas. And what you're not offering, and I think from my experience, especially with labor, this is really step number one before we get to your maxims, is to disabuse people of, for example, the truth of competitiveness.
Yes.
Let me suggest two ways. One, and I'll bring in this thing about universities too. Large firms don't compete. The idea of international competition is for domestic consumption only. If you look at the Fortune 500 individual globally, okay, what is a Japanese company? What is a United States company? What is a German company? It's no longer really easy to discern that. Okay? The idea that you have the United States versus Britain versus Britain, that's for the domestic consumption of each of those countries. Okay?
Agreed.
Competitiveness, the campaign for competitiveness is a lie. It's propaganda. It works best in this country in Detroit, when all of the big auto companies are completely interlocked with Japanese and European competitors. Universities have been complicit, especially in the last 10 years, in the name of competitiveness. University presidents have been marching arm in arm through Capitol Hill lobbying intensively in the interest of competitiveness to bring more money to the universities, more collaborative endeavors like we're talking about. And yet the universities have been selling public assets at bargain basement prices to all U.S. competitors.
Internationally,
I'm
yes.
sorry?
Internationally,
Right.
yes.
The most notorious
They're quite proud of it,
example,
yeah.
MIT selling $500 million of
The Rensselaer says, "Oh, good, the Dutch are coming knocking on our door. Isn't this wonderful?" Yeah.
The point is that competitiveness is alive. And it seems to me that that's your first order of business. That is the pressure on people, especially I'm thinking about labor. You can't consider these political considerations of design that we're talking about. When the boss is saying, if you don't do this, we're going to shut the plant. That's the first order of business. Secondly, the idea that we have to do certain things to compete. And it's very common people say, look, I like your ideas, you're right, blah, 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 but
Yeah.
if we don't do this, then the bottom line is we have to. I usually suggest that we reintroduce slavery. And then everyone laughs nervously.
Yeah.
Because we can't. And yet it might enhance our competitive position in some markets if we did have slavery. Why can't we? Because there was a civil war and a number of other things that made it not only outlawed, but made it a taboo to even raise it. 100 years ago, people would have actively been discussing whether or not to use slavery in order to compete with our competitors. And so the task is to add to the taboos. Okay. As a society, we've already acknowledged there are certain things we will not do in order to compete. suggestions.
Yes, I accept those suggestions. Although it seems to me a lot of the problems that we face have dimensions other than just that one. Let's say industrial competitiveness and the productivity of firms as compared to nations and so forth. I believe that in the evolution of modern societies, and particularly modern American societies, there are techno-political forms that we've sort of delivered ourselves over to, which have a lot of problems for the meaning of modern life, modern citizenship. For example, our relationship to electronic media and our passive acceptance of the idea that, let's say, with broadcast television and later with cable television and so forth, we define ourselves as markets. We tune in to whatever is coming down and simply accept it. This is a politics beyond, let's say, the workplace, beyond labor unions and so forth, that has to do with us as what we usually call consumers, although I don't much like that term. It has to do with us as families, as just members of society. So it seems to me that we need also to address ways in which we are absorbed by institutional forms which deny autonomy, deny freedom, deny any kind of self-determination in a whole variety of ways. With respect to environmental matters, with respect to mass media, with respect to offices, factories, farms, and so forth. I do believe that the talk about progress, competitiveness, and so forth is one of the ways in which people are deflected from seeing what needs to be seen. But I think there are a number of other ways as well. American political discourse right now is television-centered, and I think we see what has happened to that. The span of attention has now been broken down to 8 and 10-second sound bites. The most effective forms of advertising in politics are negative. This has now begun to simply poison all of political life, where American politics is quickly becoming something like a politics of disgust, the beneficiaries of which are those who are able to convince us, usually through television advertising, that it is simply too disgusting to get involved in contemporary democratic political life. Better just to sit it out. And I trace the origins of this menace to our whole way of life, to the social acceptance of a particular relationship to a whole variety of technologies, which I think we need seriously to question. Competitiveness is one question, but I think there are lots of questions that have to do with how do we want to live, and how does the structure of things around us, including technological things, what does that have to do with how we live now and how we want to live? Okay, thank you very much.